Thank you for the invitation to participate in this very stimulating conference. I'm very excited about the discussions that we're going to have today. So what I want to present today is a paper that in some ways is an extension of the book that Linda mentioned, Patronal Politics. And it's part of an effort that I've been engaged in to find ways of quantitatively testing some of the concepts, which also leads to the development of some of the concepts in the book and relating them to the literature in order to see how far this perspective might be able to help us go in terms of understanding political regimes. So the basic question is, that I'm trying to look at here in the paper is why are some countries more closed or open at a given point in time relative to others? And so I think often when we study regime change and we focus on kind of shifts of a country from one type of regime implying some sort of stability to the other, we have a tendency to overemphasize the state of the world as it exists today and to underemphasize other states of the world that had existed in the past when things might have looked rather different. And also, I think that leads us to a risk of potentially underestimating the potential for future change. I mean, I think back to the time looking at Russia in the 1990s, the questions that we were asking originally were very, very different from the kinds that we're asking today. At the time, in the late 1990s, there seemed to be a general impression that it was hard to imagine that things could change as much as they have in the 10 years that that followed. But then we see something happen, and now it seems inevitable. So really what I want to try to get at is this issue of dynamism of regimes. I think that especially if we look at indicators like levels of political closure, levels of political openness, there are a few regimes that have remained fairly stable over time, but the norm has actually been variation over time. And while a lot of it has been in the direction of authoritarianization, political closure, it's certainly not universally the case, and very often what you see, if you look at the whole post-Soviet space, is movement back and forth. So I think this regime dynamics approach hopefully can help remedy these problems. And so this is the idea of thinking about political regimes, political systems as inherently dynamic, involving this sort of regular, at least potentially predictable movement that I think we don't want to just call instability or just write off as transition to some permanent endpoint, which never seems to be quite permanent, at least not, for some countries that's arguably the case, but at least for a lot of the regimes that we're studying here. So the argument that I want to present in this particular paper is to develop the implications for the role of timing. And the basic idea is that how open or closed a political system may appear at any given moment may depend on just where it happens to be in a cycle of regular, or at least predictable, political opening and closure, rather than necessarily kind of the product of a set of factors that kind of make it a permanent fixture where it is. The approach that I adopt is I've called the Patronal Politics approach, and it draws on this notion of basically what I call a social context that I think is prevalent in most of the post-Soviet world, but actually most of the world in general. It exists to some degree everywhere, but basically what I'm talking about is a social equilibrium through which people collectively organize their political pursuits, primarily through the meting out of individualized punishments and rewards, through actual chains of personal acquaintance. So it's a type of society, it's a situation the society is in where personal connections matter. And of course, as I usually say, coming from Washington, we know political connections matter everywhere, but it's largely a matter of degree and the way that these personal connections matter. That's particularly important in the post-Soviet space. It's very hard to get anything done without working through these types of mechanisms. And so this is in contrast to societies where the rule of law is stronger, where impersonal institutions function actually in an impersonal way more often than not, and where you have more mobilization based on what Benedict Anderson has called imagined communities, communities where the actual communing, the interaction among the people doesn't necessarily take a physical form. So people are connecting on the basis of what they see or expect to be shared principles and ideas, and are not necessarily uniting on the basis of going through primarily personal connections. So this has several implications, just as far as a general political system that I've outlined here. One is that I tend to see the most important political actors in these systems not as the kinds of creatures that are often pointed to, like political parties, legislatures, these formal institutions. I think, in fact, the most important political actors are a little less visible, a little more nebulous, and these are the extended political economic networks of people. So, kind of if you take some classic examples, I mean, these would be like in the Russian case, sort of the political economic network of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, which extended which wasn't just the business empire that he owned, but it, extended into politics and all kinds of different realms in which he had his own people. Of course, Vladimir Putin's network is the most famous one now in Russia, which similarly, he has people in all kinds of realms, not just the state administration and the presidency, or even the Duma, but the corporate world through all of his friends and connections through different stages of his career and personal history. So in terms of thinking about the drivers of, or just even how to think about political closure and political openness, I tend to think of it as a reflection of the degree and extent of coordination among these political economic networks. So where these political and economic networks are tightly coordinated around the authority of a single chief patron, often a president, this tends to produce political closure. And it's not because there's any formal edict that you can't have opposition. It's not even necessarily because the president orders all of his cronies to snuff out opposition. But there's a coordination process through which these political networks recognize that it's in their best interest to recognize the authority of the president. And so, even if maybe they're not ordered to abstain from funding, say, an opposition candidate, they're probably unlikely to do so because they don't want to run afoul of the president, because everything depends on the president. So I think we can think about political closure as reflecting this tight coordination of political economic networks around a single authority. And by the same token, factors that disrupt this coordination, make it complicated to coordinate around the authority of a single individual, tend to promote political openness. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But essentially, the idea then is that factors that temporarily disrupt the coordination around the authority of a leader tend to drive what I've called regime cycles. So you might have a tight process of coordination that's sort of an equilibrium, but then something, and it's often something that's potentially exogenous, like the aging of the leader, or an external shock or something like that, or a leader entering into, for some other reason, maybe a political miscalculation or step, or I've also found related to term limits. Or just taking certain political actions that lead to expectations that a succession might be on the table. These are things that can kind of shake the coordination process, because suddenly the networks that are coordinating their authority around the president start to recognize, okay, well, this guy might not be here forever. I say guy because in practice it's mostly been guys, but in principle it could be women and men. But looking into the future, these networks have to start then preparing for that future, which then raises all kinds of problems for how they coordinate their activities. Competition competition for who might want to become the next dominant patron, trying to position yourself well with whoever you think is going to be the next chief patron, and so on. But the expectation then would be that this disruption is only temporary, because then you're going to have coordination again, and so you're going to get these patterns of regularized opening and closure. So in this slide, I note that I'm going to focus, or I focus in the paper, on one particular subset of political systems that exist in patronal, highly patronalistic countries. And so these are those with presidentialist constitutions, which I basically define as a constitution where the basically a single office, usually called a presidency, is given the symbolism of the most powerful person in terms of executive authority. And effectively what this does is it promotes coordination around a single authority by creating an official symbolism of a dominant state leader. So, and I'm not saying that like the instant you introduce a presidential system or a presidential constitution, you instantly get a dominant leader. In fact, that's part of the purpose of what what I'm going to say in a few minutes. But that this is just a factor that promotes the coordination of these networks rather than inhibits coordination of these networks around a single authority. And part of this is because only one person then, only one network can hope to hold this symbolism at one given time. So this kind of puts a little premium on it in terms of the competition among these networks that would probably rather have it rather than not. So the fact that you hold it already indicates that you already had some other power. So it reinforces the sense that you are a powerful, dominant individual. But also, if there is uncertainty, the symbolism of the presidency is likely to make this person kind of a focal point for people who might not otherwise know where to go. Okay, well, I'm not sure who's going to be more powerful in the future, but this guy's the president, so let me just, maybe I'll take that bet. Or at least, if I'm going to hedge bets, maybe place a little more eggs in that other basket. And so presidentialism then reinforces coordination around the holder of this office. And then I've argued, as I mentioned before, that I think kind of one of the keys to driving these regime cycles is when expectations start to arise that the leader is on his or her way out. And so in other work, which I won't go into here, but happy to talk about in question and answer. I think, in fact, you can explain pretty much all the color revolutions as this type of thing, which happened when issues of succession were on the table or emerging very concretely among elites, as well as almost all the ousters in the former Soviet states. So I'm not saying this is the only way in which coordination around a president can be disrupted, but I think the key of these expectations of the future. So one of the ways that political coordination, tight political coordination and closure around a leader is sustained is through the expectation that that president is going to be there for the longer term, because that prevents these kind of difficulties of coordination that can result from an uncertain future when it's uncertain who the next patron might be. So what I want to do then is test one implication and develop the implication, which isn't really developed so much in my book, which is the key role for timing with respect to these regime cycles and respect to these periods of disruption of coordination. So the basic insight is that the coordination of networks takes time. So some of you might recognize some influence from Mansur Olson's work on the rise and decline of nations, who talked about one reason of decline of nations is sort of the consolidation and collusion of networks that builds up over time, sort of elite networks. And it was precisely a process, an argument on his part that this was a process that takes time. And certainly in highly patronalistic contexts, outlined several reasons why we would expect this process of tight coordination of networks to take time. Would be, first of all, the networks are generally very complicated and even nebulous. They're not like kind of pre-carved blocks that you can just fit in a pyramid according to a blueprint when you're the president. You come to power, okay, so here's how all the networks fit into the system. Instead, there's overlapping interests, and often rival interests, and often these have to be sorted out with interests that the presidential family or new clans from the president have, right? These are people, typically presidents come to power and they have relatives who want in. And so all this makes it, so you have complex networks. They don't necessarily fit together very well. They're rivalrous among each other. There are groups within the president's network who might want to extend into the realms of some of these pre-existing networks. These pre-existing networks are typically also, to some degree at the core, fairly hardened. It's not like they can just simply be dissolved or people can be plucked away, because these personal relationships that bind them at the core are typically very deep, formed through family, classmates in school, people that you've worked with over long periods of time, these sources of trust among individuals and long-term reciprocity. In addition, these networks don't necessarily have an interest in immediately recognizing, all out the president's authority, because maybe the president will tell you to do something that you don't want him or her to do. So oftentimes I think networks have an incentive to kind of cautiously hold back from full endorsement, as a way of a kind of bargaining position, right? Because they're supportive of the president, like they're recognizing the president's authority, but they want to make sure that within the presidential pyramid of power, they get the best position possible, especially with respect to their rivals within the system. On the other hand, from the perspective of what the presidents must do, the president has to then create typically very complicated balances, especially in highly complicated, complex societies, large societies like Russia's. I mean, maybe Transnistria or Abkhazia, it's a little more tractable, but these are very complex balances that have to be undertaken. The president has to establish various systems, informal and formal, of monitoring, rewarding, sorting out rivalries, establishing reputations for carrying out what he or she says they want to do. And plus, at the same time, if they're trying to consolidate their authority, usually a new president doesn't come to power with universal acceptance. I mean, there are typically some networks or some diehard ideologues which exist in all countries. Certainly, I think the next panel will talk about some of these people, the sort of non-system opposition. These have to be marginalized. And that can be a complicated process too. The president can't simply typically just say, okay, well, everybody fall into line, shove everybody into jail. I mean, maybe they could, but that's highly risky. Because a president that overreaches risks simultaneously provoking many people to oppose him or her, in which case then there's a greater danger of political instability and undermining the president. So what typically the strategy has been throughout the post-Soviet space is the successful presidents have kind of one by one taken on individual leaders. They'll kind of pick one off, get everybody else lined up against that person. Then once that person's gone, you can go after the next person and find some pretext. And so you kind of gradually ratchet up the heat, until before people have noticed it, suddenly, the people who would be in opposition, find themselves in a very difficult political situation. So the general prediction then would be that the longer a president is in power, the more likely we are going to see a closed political regime, or the more closed the political regime is going to look, because you're going to see tighter and tighter, more effective coordination of the networks around the president's authority. And so this is specifically in the context of a presidentialist constitution. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So I want to test this quantitatively. So put together an original data set on the non-Baltic former Soviet states. So it's all country years. So basically every year for every country is in the data set between 1992 and 2016. The Baltics are excluded because other studies have categorized them as having lower levels of patronalism, and so I don't address them here. The dependent variables I look at then are indicators generally of political closure as I've described it. So originally when I did an earlier draft of this paper, I was just using Freedom House political rights scores. But then this great new data set came out from the Varieties of Democracy project at the University of Gothenburg, known as the VDEM project. And so I also then took the indicators that they have for polyarchy, which I think is the closest definition to what I use conceptually here, and so I use them. And then along with the timing with respect to how long the president has been in power since the previous ouster of a network, I include variables indicating the most important time-varying causes of democracy and authoritarianism that have appeared in the literature. So I'm primarily interested here in looking at, the logic is that in a given country, controlling for all other effects, related to that country, over time, you're going to see these effects. So I use a fixed effects linear model. So here are the basic results. The paper describes them in a little more detail, and I'm happy to elaborate in question and answer. So first is a set of results from the most basic model, which includes indicators of, GDP per capita, so economic development, economic growth, every country for every year, and the level of resource rents available to the dictator. And interestingly, it turns out that none of these indicators are significant predictors of how politically closed a political system will be at a given time on the Freedom House scale. But the number of years since the incumbent network came to power, so the number of years since the ouster of the previous network, is a very strong predictor. Almost 2 full percentage points. It can explain almost the change of 2 full percentage points on a scale that ranges between 1 and 7. So that's about a third of the variation in the system. So then we see something similar when we use the indicators of polyarchy. So this is an indication of, actually I think this should be the polyarchy scale. Sorry about that, I messed that up. But basically what this indicates is that the longer that a political network is in power, the less polyarchy you're likely to see. And here we do find an effect for levels of economic development. So basically GDP per capita is correlated with a positive polyarchy score. So higher levels of development lead to more polyarchy according to the VDEM index. So now what I want to do is to compare the timing effects with factors that are not time varying, just to get a sense of how well do these factors stack up with other factors. So for example, in the previous slide I was only looking at variation that occurs within a country over time. So that cannot be explained by factors that don't vary over time for a country, like a political legacy, which is the same over time, or whether a country is traditionally Islamic. Or the distance from Berlin, connections to, to the relationship to Europe. So what I want to do then is add these factors, and so I use a different model in this case. It's a random effects model. And I also, just for robustness, and I do this separately as well, add a control variable, which is the level of political closure in the previous year. So that really sharpens the focus on, thank you. On the effects of timing, controlling for all the things that would have made a country more open or closed before a given year. And so what we find is that the effect is almost the same. So the number of years since the previous ouster, basically the number of years a president has been in power, is a strong predictor of political closure according to Freedom House's scale. And the economic development variables remain insignificant. Actually, Islam turns out to be highly significant, almost on the level of the timing effect that I'm interested in. And then there are a few other variables that I can include here. In the interest of time, I won't go into them, but I think they actually are fairly interesting. But as we expect, the level of political closure in the year before is also significant. So this is controlling for this even. You still find this very significant effect. We find the same thing when we look at the VDEM scores of polyarchy. So we find less polyarchy the longer a president has been in power, even controlling for levels of economic development, the levels of resources available to a leader, Islam, the distance from Berlin, so sort of the relationship between to Europe is significant, and some other things. And so this is Lucan's finding on identity divides. That also is correlated with more polyarchy as he expects. So this is controlling for all of these things. So there might be just a few questions, which I'll wrap up with. So first of all, maybe one would suspect that this kind of finding holds regardless of constitution and is just a general feature. Maybe the post-Soviet space generally features a trend towards authoritarianism. So I run the analysis with only on countries that have a constitution type, what I've called a divided executive constitution, where you basically have a division between a prime minister and a president. It's roughly equal. In my book, I argue that you'll get different dynamics there. First of all, it turns out that I couldn't run that analysis because there's absolutely no variation in these countries according to Freedom House. So basically all the countries that have had this kind of constitution during the years they've had it, there's no trend one way or the other. So that is exactly what I would expect in that regard, at least the absence of a closure trend. Polyarchy scores from VDEM are more nuanced and they're much more fine-grained, and so you do see differences there. But the interesting thing is actually, so first of all, you also find that the effect of timing is not significant. So this is the point estimate and this is the 95% confidence interval. I should have clarified that earlier. But it intersects 0, so it's not significant, but it's almost significant. But the interesting thing is it's significant in the other direction. So it means that basically the more time that since the previous political ouster in a divided executive constitution country, it appears that if anything, it's more likely to become more politically open rather than politically closed. So the timing seems to go in a different direction. And then finally, it may be the point that maybe it may be the case that again, as I alluded to earlier, somebody might ask, well, maybe countries that are more authoritarian simply are better able to stay in power. Well, first of all, the figures 1 through 4 already control for key factors in the literature said to cause repressiveness. Second of all, the result holds controlling for the previous year's level of authoritarianism. So that should be absorbing pretty much all of those repression effects. And finally, we can test whether or not repressiveness predicts ouster of a network. And so that's what the final set of slides that I'll show is. And so basically just a simple fixed effects regression. And so basically looking at the question of, do more politically closed countries, according to the measures I'm looking at, have a higher likelihood of the regime the network being ousted. So as you can see, the effects are not significant. So almost, the point estimate's almost 0, and then the 95% confidence interval kind of spans both sides. And this is with the Freedom House measures, and then this is with the VDEM measures. So just to wrap up, some concluding thoughts are that timing with respect to regime cycles, I think, is or should be a major explanation of why one country appears more authoritarian than others at any given point in time. So the fact that a president has been given more time to do so will explain why it might be more authoritarian. Then you'll have an interruption, which might set a country back, and then it'll also kind of head back up. And so I think at least at a minimum, it stacks up quite comparably to the explanatory power of the factors that more usually appear in the literature. And according to some measures, it seems to be even a greater effect. And I think this it highlights what we can gain by thinking about the dynamics, the kind of year-to-year dynamics in how political openness and closure form, not just what they're not just treating them as kind of outcomes as they are. So I'm not saying that explaining the outcomes is not a good thing to do. I mean, I think this the statistical findings actually confirm some of these earlier studies, but my point is just I think there's something to be gained by really focusing on the dynamism of these regimes. So let me wrap it up there. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much.